6 days shall you labor. 6 days.
Giving way to the Renaissance and Enlightenment. Whether or not Dante knew it, Europe's next great military foe was already, during his own lifetime, growing in power across the Mediterranean from Italy. After fleeing from the Mongolian invasion of Anatolia with his father Ertugrul, then the Bey or chief of the Oghuz Turkic Kayai tribe, young Atman or Othman ascended as Osman Bey in 1280 AD and would go on to expand his Ottoman Bilag or Emirate from the towns of Bithynia and Sogud, eventually attacking the Byzantine Eastern Roman Empire near Nicaea, Ephesus near the Aegean Sea, and the city of Bursa. Coupled with the Black Death's decimation entering Anatolia and the Balkans in 1347, the Ottomans' continual military advancements eventually wore down the resistance of Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire, and after a 53...
Now, in Flat Earth Nation world, be understanding this is when all of Asia departed Paul. And then they came out after the 1,000 years with the playbook in hand from the synagogue of Satan personally.
Day siege in 1453, the city finally fell to Mehmed II, the Conqueror, 1432 to 1481, seventh Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire would prove a unified front in opposition to a disunited Europe throughout the next few centuries. But the Ottoman Turks were not alone in playing a part in the future of Europe. Nicholas Flamel, 1330 to 1418 AD, a French manuscripts dealer posthumously heroized as a leading alchemist of his time, was attributed as having learned the arts of metallurgy on the road to Santiago de Compostela. Works purporting to be attributable to Flamel, including the philosophical summary, first published in The Transformation of Metals, Paris, Gilliard, 1561, and the Book of Hieroglyphic Figures, first published in the Third Tractate of Natural Philosophy, Paris, Vouvet, Guillemot, 1612, continued to arise for centuries following his death. Around Flamel's own lifetime, according to the Book of Abramelin the Mage, the earliest extant German manuscripts of which now known date to around 1608, Abraham of Worms, Germany, circa 1362 to 1458, studied under Abramelin, an Egyptian scholar, in around 1409, and Abramelin imparted to Abraham a system of magic number square layments. Meanwhile, in the Confessio Fraternitatis, the Confession of the Brotherhood of RC, first printed in Kassel, Germany in 1615, the birth date of Frater CRC, the work's protagonist, is explicitly listed as 1378. By the 1453 AD fall of Byzantine Constantinople, or rise of Turkish Istanbul, depending on one's personal point of view. There were already empires in the land masses we call now Central and South America as well, although these remained undiscovered by and unknown about to the populations of Europe until around 1492, when the Italian explorer for Spain, Christopher Columbus, began the conquests of these lands for Europe. In 1438, the Inca Empire was established by Pachacuti, and by the 1450s, Machu Picchu, in modern-day Peru, was completed. In 1428, the three Nahuatl city-states, Tenochtitlan, modern Mexico City, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, formed a triple alliance, and from 1440 to 1469, Moctezuma I led this Aztec empire to become the dominant power in Mesoamerica. By way of comparison, 1441 was the year in which Portuguese navigators re-established the European slave trade by importing a shipment of African slaves into Portugal. It should be obvious that in the first half of the 15th century, civilizations were expanding rapidly in South and Mesoamerica, but were beginning to fall apart in Europe. This culminated in the overthrow of the Byzantine Empire by the Ottoman Empire, and the death of the last Roman emperor, Constantine XI.
Baloney.
Again, for comparison, consider that it wasn't until 1456, 25 years after she'd been burnt alive at the stake for heresy, that Joan of Arc, 1412 to 1431, who was only 19 when she was executed, was acquitted of all charges by the Catholic papacy of the time. While England was embroiled in the War of the Roses, a civil war between the houses of York and Lancaster, from 1455 to 1485 AD, Spain began to become an empire. Perhaps emboldened by the 1462 victory of Wallachian Prince Vlad III Dracula, 1431 to 1476, in the night attack against Mehmed II the Conqueror. In 1469, Ferdinand II of Aragon, 1452 to 1516, and Isabella I of Castile, 1451 to 1504,
Fake.
to unify Spain, but quickly enough made apparent their loyalties by introducing the Inquisition. The first Spanish auto de fe was in 1481, launching foreign explorations for more resources, hence Christopher Columbus's discovery of the New World for them in 1492, and in the same year enacting the expulsion of and pogroms against all the Jews of Spain. Around the middle of the 1400s AD, there was a boom in the birth rate of seemingly innovative geniuses. Following the death of Filippo Brunelleschi, 1377 to 1446, inventor of one-point perspective, and around the time of the first publication of the Gutenberg Bible in Mainz, Germany, in 1455, and Mentel, German language Bible, in 1466, came the births of John Cabot, circa 1450 to 1499, Italian-English founder of Newfoundland, Hieronymus Bosch, circa 1450 to 1516, early Netherlandish painter, Christopher Columbus, 1451 to 1506, Italian explorer for Spain, Leonardo da Vinci, 1452 to 1519, Florentine Italian polymath, Amerigo Vespucci, 1454 to 1512,
Fake.
who discovered the east coast of South America in 1499.
All fake history.
1509. Johann Trithemius, 1462 to 1516, German Benedictine abbot. Niccolo Machiavelli, 1469 to 1527,
Jesuit.
Italian author. Albert Dürer, 1471 to 1528, German artist. Nicholas Copernicus, 1473 to 1523, born in Thorn, Royal Prussia, Kingdom of Poland, and the father of modern astronomy. Thomas More, 1478 to 1516, author of Utopia. Dr. Johann Georg Faust, circa 1480 or 1466 to circa 15.
Fairy tale.
Itinerant German Renaissance alchemist and magician. Raphael, 1483 to 1520, Italian painter. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa von Nettensheim, 1486 to 1535,
Alchemist.
German polymath.
Alchemist.
Philippus Aurelius Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, called Paracelsus, 1493 to 1541, Swiss polymath and alchemist, and finally Suleiman the Magnificent, 1494 to 1566, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. All of these men would go on to shape the geopolitical and philosophical landscapes of the following century. Notable deaths in the 1400s included, of course, Nicholas Flamel, 1330 to 1418, as well as the apocryphal characters of Abraham of Worms, circa 1362 to 1458, from the Book of Abramelin, and Frater CRC, 1378 to 1484, of the RC Manifestos. Undoubtedly, the dominant figures of the 15th century were Vlad Tepes Dracula, 1431 to 1476, and the Italian Renaissance humanist, polymath, and cryptographer Leon Battista Alberti, 1404 to 1472. Now, if the protagonist of the RC Manifestos, Frater CRC, is said in the Confessio, 1615 AD, to have been born in 1378 and to have lived for 106 years, then it can be reasoned out his founding the RC fraternity would have occurred around the year 1407. The book, The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz in the year 1459, first appeared in German, printed in Strasbourg in the year 1616.
Now, I don't know where these years fit in my timeline, but what I do know is the Rosicrucians, the Order of the Rosy Dawn, or whatever they, Golden Dawn, the Theosophists, they're the bad guys. They did this. We don't want to fight them. We don't want to have a house in the suburbs. We draw a line in the sand and say, this is my house. I'll die for it. Watch me, honey. Don't worry. I'll get them all, and you won't get raped and the kids won't get hurt forever and ever.
And although initially published as authored anonymously, ultimately in his autobiography, a Lutheran theologian and author of Description of the Republic of Christianopolis, Johann Valentinius André, 1586 to 1654, claimed authorship of it. In this work, considered the third RC Manifesto, it is claimed that Frater CRC, called Christian Rosenkreuz therein, was knighted around Easter Sunday, 1459. Notably, it was on exactly that day in 1459 that the constitutions of the Freemasons of Strasbourg was first signed in Regensburg, with a second signed shortly afterward in Strasbourg. At the opening of the 16th century AD, Abbot Trithemius, 1462 to 1516, was instructing Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, 1486 to 1535, and Paracelsus, 1493 to 1541, on his Steganographia in Germany, where Dr. Faust, 1480 to 1541, yet wandered. The first African slaves were shipped to the New World in around 1502. Michel de Nostradam, 1503 to 1566, was born in France. From 1508 to 1512, Michelangelo painted the fresco ceilings of the Sistine Chapel in Rome, Italy, expressing with slightly exaggerated mannerism the peak of the Italian Renaissance. From 1509 to 1510, the Great Plague swept across various parts of Tudor England, and for decades following this event, symptoms of a so-called sweating sickness continued to be reported to doctors. By 1551, when John Caius of Shrewsbury finally wrote down notes on this seemingly long-term epidemic, there had been 5 different outbreaks of it across England. Then, as the first decade of the 16th century AD came to a close, there were 3 works that were released as publicly printed, widely distributed works of literature that have since then permanently changed the face of Western philosophical thinking. The first of these was the 1512 Commentaries by Copernicus, 1473 to 1543, proposing the heliocentric model of the solar system, with the sun at the center and the planets, including Earth, all orbiting around it. The second published work that altered people's ways of thinking forever afterward was the 1513 work by Niccolo Machiavelli, 1469 to 1527, The Prince, a geopolitical satire. The third work was equally impactful, but its effect was overshadowed by the geopolitical events that quickly followed it. This was the publication in Latin around 1560 of the St. Thomas More 1478 to 1535 work Utopia, printed in Louvain, edited by Desideratus Erasmus Rotterdamerus 1466 to 1536, a Dutch Renaissance humanist, and ultimately printed in Basel in 1515. The book was not translated into More's native tongue of English until the 1551 Ralph Robinson edition, some 16 years following More's execution for treason for refusing to swear the oath of supremacy to Henry VIII after he'd split the Anglican Church away from Catholicism. St. More opposed both Anglicanism and the Lutheran Protestant Reformation and was a staunch proponent of Catholicism, despite expressing different ideas in his Utopia.
I'll bet he did.
The geopolitical events that overshadowed the first publication in Latin of Utopia were, namely, the very Lutheran Protestant Reformation and split of Anglicanism away from Catholicism that St. More opposed. In 1517, the year after More's Latin Utopia was published in the Netherlands, Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses in Saxony. 2 years later, Leonardo da Vinci, 1452 to 1519, passed on of natural causes at the age of 67. In the same year as Leonardo's death, Charles I of Spain, 1500 to 1559 AD, ascended the throne of the Holy Roman Emperor as Charles V and ruled until 1556. Under his edicts, Spain was positioning itself to expand into the first truly global empire.
Oh boy.
In the same year as his ascension, a Spanish expedition commanded by Ferdinand Magellan, 1480 to 1521, and Juan Sebastian Elcano, 1476 to 1526, set out to circle the entire planet and returned successful in 1522. In the same year as Charles V's coronation as HRE, also, Hernán Cortés led the Spanish conquest of Mexico, which lasted from 1519 to 1521. In Spain proper, the Inquisition and Jewish purges continued, and the result of all this imperial posturing was ultimately that, in 1557, Habsburg Spain was forced to declare financial bankruptcy, the first of 4 times, 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596, that Philip II, Charles V's successor, would have to do so. Not only the imperial posturing of European continental Spain's rulers posed problems for the European nation-states of the era, but also the continuing unified front of opposition to the south and southeast of Europe, the Ottoman Empire, that was by that time directly administering a larger landmass than all continental Europe combined. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, 1494 to 1566, stretching from Basra and Baghdad in the far east, to Algiers on the North African coast in the far west, and as far north into Eastern Europe as Buda, near Vienna, Austria. In 1527 AD, the unthinkable occurred, and Rome was sacked and burned. Pope Clement VII and his loyal 42 Swiss Guards escort narrowly escaping down the Passetto di Borgo, a secret corridor between Vatican City and Castel di Sant'Angelo, while behind them the imperial troops of Charles V, HRE, slaughtered the remaining 147 Swiss Guard troops on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. More than merely bringing a sour end to the Italian Renaissance, this event demonstrated the vulnerability of the papacy to the whole world at a critical moment in history. Begun in 1517, within a decade the Protestant Reformation movement was growing strong, and this plus the sack of Rome emboldened Henry VIII of England to annul his own marriage, breaking from Catholic tradition, and to, from 1531 to 1532, establish the Anglican Church as autonomous from Catholicism. It was into this world that John Dee, 1527 to 1609, was born, in the same year as the sack of Rome. Other news stories from the 1530s would have involved the 1531 Inca Civil War between the brothers Atahualpa and Huáscar, the 1536 establishment of the Inquisition in Portugal, and the 1537 partial translation into English of the Bible in the William Tyndale 1494 to 1536 edition.
Fake, 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 fake.
In 1559 AD, Elizabeth I, 1533 to 1603, was coronated Queen of England, and her reign is generally considered the height of the English Renaissance. Nevertheless, in the midst of her reign, in 1563, a plague outbreak killed 80,000 people in England, 20,000 in London alone. In 1565, the Hospitallers, a crusading order of chivalric knights, defeated the Ottoman Empire's troops at the siege.
And you see how they needed this history, that they just needed to shade and hide and just bump into the Bible every now and then to tease the people to Atlantis. But it's the Bible. Oh, I pray that you understand that.
Of Malta. This battle, in some sense, may have turned back the tide of the encroaching Ottoman menace, because the following year, Suleiman the Magnificent, 1494 to 1566,
Vortex
died. In the same year, Michel Nostradamus, 1503 to 1566, died. In the 1570s, the news was much ado over international affairs with the final Spanish conquest of the last remaining Inca leader, Tupac Amaru, at Vilcabamba, Peru, and his execution in Cuzco in 1572. In 1577, English explorer Francis Drake set out to repeat the Spanish explorer Magellan's feat of circumnavigating the globe, and Drake returned from his voyage in 1580. That same year, Spain, presumably tired of declaring bankruptcy, unified with Portugal under Philip II, securing a partnership that lasted 60 years, until 1640. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII issued the final report on calendar reform to account for the gradual changing in durations of our planetary.
Oh, here we go. This is part of their fake history and the calendar. So keep your trust alert on high.
Motions, redacting 11 days from October 4th Julian, skipping to October 15th Gregorian. It was into this world that were born Tycho Brahe, 1546 to 1601, Danish astronomer; Giordano Bruno, 1548 to 1600, Italian astronomer; William Shakespeare, 1564 to 1616, English playwright; Galileo Galilei, 1564 to 1642, a Tuscan Italian physicist and astronomer; Michelangelo Merisi de Caravaggio, 1571 to 1610, Italian painter; Johannes Kepler, 1571 to 1630,
Bad man.
German astronomer;
Bad man.
Thomas Hobbes, 1588
Bad
to
man.
1679, English philosopher and author of
They're all bad. They're
and finally
Rosicrucian.
René Descartes, 1596 to 1650,
Bad.
French philosopher.
Bring them down, old world. Get the nations in
By the turn of
charge.
the 17th century AD, John Dee, 1527 to 1609, had already returned from his travels abroad on the European continent, entertaining at the court of Rudolph II, Habsburg HRE, 1576 to 1612, in Bohemia, studying Torah with Judah Loeb ben Bezalel, Maharal of Prague, 1512 to 1609, and summoning the Enochian angels with his scrying partner Edward Kelly, 1555 to 1597. His home and libraries having been ransacked and looted while he'd been away, John Dee was likely not more equipped to process the news than would have been René Descartes that year.
Yeah, and right. That because it was all fake, and he's fake, and they use him to prop him up. Oh, I wrote the King James Bible, blah, blah, blah. Oh, man, fake news. It's all fake news.
His fourth birthday, the Giordano Bruno, 1548 to 1600, was burned at the stake in Rome's Campo de' Fiori by the Catholic papacy for various charges of heresy. Bruno was a professed pantheist and believed in reincarnation, but because he also advocated that stars in the night sky are only distant suns alike our own, that may possibly host planets of their own that house different forms of life than our own, his ritual cremation was seen as a kind of martyrdom for science.
What?
Again, the Catholic papacy
Starport, baby.
Rome was trying and failing to maintain the same powerful hegemony it had enjoyed throughout the dark ages of feudal Europe, rather than adapting to changing times.
That was in case you didn't notice. Fort, the Vatican. For some bad people.
The Catholic papacy of Vatican City and Rome was trying and failing to maintain the same powerful hegemony it had enjoyed throughout the dark ages of feudal Europe, rather than adapting to changing times. Having begun losing the many genius luminaries of the past century to old age and death, there was a definite feeling of empowerment and a tension over how this power would be released that could be palpably felt among the European peoples. The printing press had brought educational opportunities to former serfs and elevated many from the status of pages to tradecraft shop masters.
Wow, big deal.
The New World in the Americas had literally opened up a world of opportunities for people to explore and travel. The momentum of Undertow toward that later notion of manifest destiny was already tugging at the heartstrings of European imperialists.
There's your double-headed eagle you love so much, you world. Not you guys. You guys are the salt of the earth. The world loves everything crazy, like especially UFOs in Atlantis.
Mid-1550s. John Dee had made no mistake when, as a younger man of 28 years of age, he had invested his inherited stocks in the livery company of the City of London, called the Worshipful Company of Mercers, into the Muscovy.
I wonder if somebody advised him to do that. What a genius he was at 28. The wonderful worshipers. Yay, John Dee. He was, you know what? I'm not saying he was gay. He did.
Company, the first major English joint stock trading company, with outlines for foreign trade expansion, including military imperialism, in 1555. 1555 was also the year Nostradamus published Les Prophéties, a collection of his quatrain prophecies.
Blah, blah, blah.
By 1600, the darkness both John Dee and Nostradamus rightly foresaw had fallen across the face of Europe. In 1602, the Dutch East India Company was established by a nationalizing merger of competing trade corporations. The following year, Elizabeth I of England, 1533 to 16.
No, here comes the fall of the Golden Age. I'm looking for 1711 information in their history. I see a Pretolia. There's a skeleton behind the despondent queen.
Died. In 1605, the gunpowder plot against the English Parliament was planned, but foiled before it could be executed. In 1607, Jamestown, Virginia was settled as the first permanent English colony in North America.
Yeah, Starfort.
Clearly,
come on.
The age of competitive imperialism was begun. In around 1609 AD, John Dee died as well. But just before this, in 1607 or so, a strange event occurred. The first of what would later prove to be no fewer than two definitive manifestos appeared in Germany, having been published
Here we go.
presumably through the same publishers, again in Louvain, modern Belgium. The distributed the 1609 edition of the Heinrich Kunrath of Hamburg, 1560 to 1605 work, The Alchemist's Lab. The first two RC manifestos are strange enough on their own, but the third manifesto, The Chemical Wedding, complicates matters further, as having been published anonymously initially, and later claimed as his own Ludibrium by Johann Valentin André, 1586 to 1654, a plausible enough claim, though possibly dubious nevertheless. The Chemical Wedding includes John Dee's unique Monas Hieroglyphica symbol, invitation opening narrative. In 1611 AD, the first editions of the King James Bible rolled off of Gutenberg printing presses and were distributed to Anglican churches. The first complete copies of the Bible in English, rather than Church Latin, opened up whole new worlds to the minds of apt pupils, ever eager to digest more. But this new empowering liberation of the working class minds did not arrive without taking a toll in return. In 1618, the Bohemian Protestant revolt, following the defenestration of Prague, led to the 30 Years' War, lasting from 1618 to 1648, in which the office of the HRE struggled to maintain its relevance in increasingly modernizing times. Emperor Ferdinand II's early defeat of the Bohemian rebels in the 1620 Battle of the White Mountain occurred simultaneously to the Puritan Brownist pilgrims arriving at Plymouth Rock in Cape Cod on the Mayflower. But those seeking to escape oppression from the continental European and mainland Asian empires were to find little opportunity to relax in these new American colonies. In 1622, Algonquin natives killed 347 English settlers outside Jamestown, Virginia, 1/3 of the colony's population, and burned the Heinrichs settlement. However, instead of withdrawing colonizing troops from America entirely, the apparent and immediate result of the Algonquin raids was that the Dutch West India Company founded New Amsterdam in 1625.
New York.
In 1626, construction on St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City, Rome, Italy, was declared officially completed. In 1631, Mount Vesuvius in Campania, Italy, erupted, and in 1633, Galileo Galilei, 1564 to 1642, Italian astronomer, arrived in Rome for his trial before the Inquisition. Ultimately, by the end of the 17th century AD, a truly new world order had begun to take shape in the philosophies of commoners, as in 1649, King Charles I of England was executed for treason against the public parliament. Were it not for such events as this having happened in prior history, then Dennis Diderot, 1713 to 1784.
Yeah, remember that's their happening in their version of prior history. They're just writing their book, but God wrote a book also.
Could not have posited that mankind will never be free until the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest. The 17th century ended with the Salem, Massachusetts witch trials, 1692. Beginning at the end of the second decade of the 17th century AD,
here we go.
There were, again, as in the first decade of the preceding century, 3 major works of literature published that would serve to plot much of popular philosophical thinking.
This is the devil's plan.
And possibly even for time immemorial beyond that. By the end of the 17th century, the 1687 publication of the work Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy by Isaac Newton, 1642 to 1727, had irrevocably altered the history of our species, establishing the stylistic foundation.
Yeah, they altered the history of our species, and physically and mentally. He looks like a Habsburg more every time I see him.
For all subsequent schools of material science that followed. However, again, without the publication of these 3 works earlier in that century, Newton's own calculations would not have been fathomed then, and our present history would look drastically different from how it appears to us now. In 1619 AD, Johann Kepler, 1571 to 1630, published Harmonices Mundi, the harmony of the world, in which he proposed the distance between planetary orbits may be derived using...
Some people think he killed Kepler, Johannes Kepler. They think that. I don't know. My daughter thought that for a while.
A ratio like that determining musical harmonics, and in 1621, published a second edition of his older work, originally published at Tübingen in 1596, the year René Descartes was born, entitled Mysterium Cosmographicum, the Cosmic Mystery, in which he proposed the distance relationships between the 6 planets known at that time could be understood in terms of the 5 Platonic solids enclosed within a sphere that represented the orbit of Saturn. In both these works, Kepler used complex calculus and geometries that have proven to differ from observable conditions in reality, but which nevertheless warrant great scrutiny and study, being that they inspired the shortly subsequent work, the Principia, or Principles of Isaac Newton, which contained even more mathematically accurate models accounting for real-world observations.
Baloney!
It may be overlooked sometimes that without the successful publications and lack of persecution by the Vatican papacy of Johann Kepler, there would likely not have been able to have been the 1687 work, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy by Sir Isaac Newton. It was almost as though, by attempting to propose a perfect or ideal model for the solar system's orbits, Kepler's work proved a tipping point, after which subsequent researchers who wished to adhere more acutely to observational data only could proceed to do so with less reprisal from Rome. In 1627 AD, published posthumously to his passing by 1 year, the work by Francis Bacon, 1561 to 1626, appeared as a work of the same genre as Thomas More's Utopia of 1516 and Johann Valentin Andrea's Christianopolis of 1619. Bacon's use of More's utopian model was so recognizable that almost a century later, English satirist Jonathan Swift, 1667 to 1745, parodied it in Book 3 of his 1726 work, amended 1735, Gulliver's Travels. While the deadpan ironic Swiftian writing style in Gulliver's may make the topic more approachable for children, it remains nevertheless an important idea to consider, and an innately Rosicrucian ideal project. If you could design your own model for a perfect society, and build it from the ground up, what would it be like? What would you impose? And which would you relax or remove? Which replace? And with what others? Creating a utopia is a fascinating thought experiment that would never have become possible for authors such as Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679, let alone Thomas Jefferson, 1743 to 1826, to explore were it not for the original ideas of Thomas More, 1478 to 1535. Being inspired into activity, possibly, it is very likely, by the RC manifestos, Francis Bacon was seen as the founder of modern empiricism, and this was juxtaposed in the popular mindset at that time by the rationalism of French philosopher René Descartes, 1596 to 1650. In 1637 AD, René Descartes published Discours de la Méthode, the Discourse on the Method in French, and in 1641, Meditations on First Philosophy. As a young man traveling across Europe, Descartes had been caught up into the cause of the HRE and had fought at the Battle of the White Mountain against Protestant Bohemian rebels. Following this, he had secluded himself away in Germany and proceeded to produce his magnum opuses, the Discourse on Method and Meditations on First Philosophy. However, when he returned to France and published his works, he met a very surprised audience of his old friends who explained to him that there were rumors circulating about Descartes saying he had joined the Rosicrucians. Descartes denied it on the grounds of empirical evidence, ironically, by pointing out that if he belonged to that true and invisible order, how could anyone see him? Descartes' own philosophy laid the foundation for 17th century continental rationalism, later advocated by Baruch Spinoza, 1632 to 1677, and Gottfried Leibniz, 1646
There's
to
a dude, man.
and opposed by the empiricist school of thought, consisting of Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679, John Locke, 1632 to 1704, George Berkeley, 1685 to 1753, and David Hume, 1711 to 1776. Empiricism states that knowledge comes only or primarily from sensory experience, but rationalism is defined as a methodology or a theory in which the criterion of the truth is not sensory, but intellectual and deductive. In short, Cartesian doubt was little.
You want to look at the legs? How many legs do you see? Where are his legs starting and ending? That's the gimmick on that one. Where do the legs start? Where do they end?
More than dressed up solipsism, while Baconian method was little more than pirates' materialism. By this point, both extremes were far from the course charted for them by the papacy. Perhaps a point that is sometimes missed also is that both rationalism and empiricism sought to attain truth, albeit by using only either first inductive or first deductive reasoning, respectively. Had they been able to cooperate rather than compete, perhaps more truths would be known by now.
You know my side.
The identity of the author of the RC manifestos, including as well the third manifesto, The Chemical Wedding, assuming its authorship was initially also anonymous, remains open to debate even as I write this, some 400 years afterwards. So is it possible that the RC manifestos were written by John Dee just prior to his death in 1609 AD? Could the characters of Abraham of Worms and Frater CRC have been a fictional romanticization of Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, 1486 to 1535, and Paracelsus, 1493 to 1541, respectively, by the respective authors of the Magic of Adam and Lamb, 1608, and the RC Manifestos in 1614? Or were Abraham of Worms and Frater CRC actually themselves both only students of Nicholas Flamel, 1330 to 1418, as had been both Agrippa and Paracelsus the students of Abbot Trithemius, 1462 to 1516? Was the Chemical Wedding, Third RC Manifesto, really written as a ludibrium on utopiae by Johann Valentin Andrea, 1586 to 1654? And did this work's real author intend to correspond the date of the events described in it to the exact date of the signing of the first Freemason constitutions in 1459? Was the RC order, as described in the manifestos, real? Might the cipher manuscripts of the 20th century Golden Dawn order, discovered to have been written in a code developed by Trithemius, be evidence that Frater CRC, possibly with Abraham of Worms and Nicholas Flamel, founded the RC order in 1407, just as described in the manifestos, and that Trithemius, Agrippa, and Paracelsus, ostensibly as well as Michel Nostradamus, John Dee, and Judah Loeb, had all been actual members of this real secret society, whose formation undeniably later had such a strong influence on Freemasonry. Is Rosicrucianism merely a philosophical sister system to that of Freemasonry, or were the Golden Dawn rituals originally intended to be the inner order behind the Blue Lodge initiation rituals of Freemasonry? All of these are valid questions, with definite, although as of yet unknown, answers. Besides the 1516 AD Utopia by Thomas More, 1478 to 1535, there was another novel written prior to the 1619 work Christianopolis by Johann Valentin Andrea, 1586 to 1654, that can be said to fall into the same literary genre, and this may lend credence to Andrea's claim to have written The Chemical Wedding in around 1605 as a ludibrium parodying the premise of the RC manifestos. In 1602, the work La Cité del Sole, Italian for the City of the Sun, was written, later published in Latin in Frankfurt in 1623 and Paris in 1638, by Tommaso Campanella, 1568 to 1639, an Italian Dominican friar and philosopher. This work, subtitled A Poetical Dialogue Between the Grand Master of the Knights Hospitallers and a Genoese sea captain, his guest, describes a theocratic monarchy where goods, women, and children are held in common, that also resembles the city of Addisonton in the Picatrix, translated into Spanish in 1257, an Arabic grimoire of astrological magic. If Andrea wrote Christianopolis in 1619 as a ludibrium of the 1602 work City of the Sun by Campanella, then it would seemingly substantiate his claim of having written The Chemical Wedding likewise as a similar joke on the RC manifestos. Whether the RC order, as described in the RC manifestos, was real or not, by 1647 AD, the idea of such an invisible college was being advocated and possibly even assembled by Robert William Boyle, 1627 to 1691. Based on this premise, the Royal Society of London for Improving Natural Knowledge, commonly called now simply the Royal Society, was founded in 1660 by a charter from King Charles II, 1630 to 1685. Thus, whether the original intent of the RC order was to form an international secret society, or simply to forward the Protestant Reformation toward the direction of physical science, by the second half of the 17th century, just such a council of learned elders had assembled as a school in England, tasked with just that purpose. The connection of inspiration between the RC order and the Royal Society is a matter of much historical accounting and considered relatively indisputable. However, the difference between an order
stones is a structure that was erected in 1980. The stones are covered in inscriptions. There are these 4 main tablets that have the inscriptions on them. There are 10 guidelines. They're written in 8 different modern languages, and the top have 4 different ancient languages, also with some interesting inscriptions. And I believe those are even hieroglyphics. It's just very bizarre. Like, who would do this? Who would put these up here in the middle of nowhere? Past of these guide stones. The stones list 10 guidelines, a set of principles, but here's where it gets weird. We don't really know who made them. Like, is it Illuminati? Is it the
Rosicrucian?
There are a lot of conspiracies about how these came to be.